Andrew, thanks for joining us today. Obviously, it's an interesting time in the industry, and live sports is coming back. And so last week when we got the email that showed that you guys did a report on the value of live sports, I know that's one of the big questions. Obviously, the RSN networks are all wondering how are they going to get the value of their properties back up there as far as the return, hopefully, of the NBA and the NHL and MLB with a little bit of luck, whatever the hell's going on with baseball. So I know you want to give us an overview of the genesis of this project, because obviously the last 12 weeks, was that a good time to be going in a project like this? Or
Right. No, it came out of conversations we were having a lot internally and with our clients over sort of a real world deprivation study. We kind of realized, I don't know when, 6 to 8 weeks into this, that wow, there's no live sports on, and what are sports fans thinking in this time? We had seen some of the cord cutting numbers already starting to emerge. We knew there were a lot of behavioral trends that had shifted, that people were, for instance, watching streaming services a lot more and gaming a lot more. So we're trying to understand, okay, what's the mindset of the sports fan? And then when sports do come back, as you mentioned, where's the pent-up demand? Is there a lot of pent-up demand? And then there are a lot of variables now, especially hearing things like, well, there's not going to be fans in the stands. So what does that mean for a sports fan who's excited about watching their team? So we kind of wanted to understand all these dynamics. So we decided to put out a study that just explores, the mindset again of where sports fans are thinking this is all going, their excitement levels, the pent-up demand, what they're going to be doing less of maybe when sports comes back. And then, how does this affect the bundle, which I think we can start right away and talk about that notion. I think one of the big findings that really surprised us, there was no surprise that sports fans were going to be excited for the return and that they were going to watch. I think everybody knew that. I think it was a reevaluation for a lot of sports fans of how much sports means to their lives, where people had never had to really think about it sort of that introspectively before of what does sports mean to me? And I think when it went away, we asked some questions and you're starting to see sports fans saying, wow, I had no idea sports was this big of a part of my life. Right. And, I have all this other time now in my hands to do things with, which can be good. But I think, as we're seeing, a lot of sports fans are saying now, okay, now we're ready to come back. I've taken piano lessons and I've done this or that, but now I'm ready to get back to watching sports. So one of the first things, as I mentioned, we wanted to just get a sense of, you've heard a lot in recent years that sports and news are holding up the bundle. So we wanted to understand, well, how much so, and how are consumers really thinking about this? In this slide, you see that live sports is basically the number one single genre among people who watch sports ever. That's their most important reason to decide to pay for television. And I think it speaks to the power of the bundle long term. It speaks to the centerpiece of live sports, again, in their lives and in what they want to pay for. As you can see, news is strong too, but you look at the MVPDs and the VMVPDs, both said the number one single genre is live sports. When that goes away for a long time, that has a big effect on cord cutting, obviously, at least near term. But I think it's also leading to a reevaluation of why they're paying for television still today. The thing that was interesting to us too, if you look at VMVPD marketing in the space, you see a lot of marketing over the last year or two is really about live sports as they brought live sports onto these platforms. And we see that really reflected in the data too. So even the VMVPD subs are even more highly likely to value live sports in the bundle over and beyond MVPD live sports subscribers. So pretty interesting. One of the things we see too in this data is that when you start to look at people who have higher levels of sports packages, they're paying for premium channels on their bundles or certain RSNs. Those people are even more likely to say, of course, that they're valuing live sports and deciding to pay for TV.
Right.
One of the other things we wanted to really get a handle on is when live sports returns, what's going to be the expected behavior? As I mentioned, I think, we're seeing this in early ratings from NASCAR and golf that people certainly are going to come back. There's no doubt about that. But how much more are they going to come back? And right away, people are basically saying that they think they're going to be watching more sports, even though they're sports viewers. They're going to be watching more when it comes back. And we think that's sort of the pent-up demand effect It's just been gone for so long that when it comes back, there's going to be a lot of early consumption. So this is a great news. Again, if you're the NBA or NHL coming back, MLB coming back, we really think, that first month, there's going to be a huge uptick and people just watching as much as they can just to, get back at it. And that's really reflected in all demos and distributors. The under 40s are even more exciting if you have pay TV for it to come back.
So they're confusing me here. So wait, 22% of them said they'll watch less, and then 46% said they'll watch more. I mean, clearly that's the most as far as watching more. And I always, I'm over 50, so I guess I can say this, but for a lot of people under 40, I know are like, I'm cutting the cord. I'll just get by. So is this kind of counterintuitive, this number of the 46%? What's your sense on that?
I think what it is if you are an under 40 who has pay television in the house and you're a sports fan, right, there's a really good chance you have an even higher degree of affinity. And that's kind of why you're there. And that's generally what we see is that's one of the few reasons potentially you even still have a package of sports. So there's that group. Right. But then there's this other group, which is also the highest, as you point out, who are likely to watch less, which that might be a suggestive of, of all the groups, they might be a little bit higher to cord cut. So there is some of those people in that demo. But, one thing we saw in the data, and I don't want to say it surprised us, but it's important to understand is that under 40 with pay TV, there's a lot of affinity there for live sports.
Gotcha. So they're the ones who value sports the most because they're also the ones who are most likely to cut the cord.
Yes, exactly. Right. If you haven't cut by now and you're an under 40 sports fan, you're really waiting for it to come back and you have a lot of demand. Exactly.
Right. Gotcha. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So 75% miss watching live TV sports.
Yeah. So some of these attitudes I mentioned, at the top, 75% again, missing watching just live sports on TV. That's not really a surprise, but I think some of the other attitudes were. 2/3 saying they actually appreciate sports more now. Really interesting that it matters to them even more now. Half say that they're looking forward to watching more live sports than they did before. Again, that's sort of reflected in our net changes. And about half saying, I did not realize how much live sports were a part of my life before this sort of real life deprivation study happened. And then I also thought the final one attitude was interesting. The idea that, I've even started actively searching for sports I don't typically watch just to get the sports fix. And again, we're seeing that. I think you're seeing that reflected in some of the NASCAR numbers, golf, even horse racing on television more than it was before, as people are just looking for anything sort of sports related to get them through this time.
Right. It really is fascinating how you don't realize until it's not there how much of a soundtrack of our lives is, right? And also you can't go out to restaurants, right? But obviously when you go to restaurants and bars, there was always sports on, right? So you're just it was always part of the thing. You just took it for granted.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that people didn't necessarily anticipate as much, because you're right, it was such a background for so many people that they hadn't really thought about it necessarily until it went away. And we're still hearing in qualitative groups just anecdotes of what you're describing of, I'm still throwing on NFL Network, and if they're playing games, I'm having that play in the background just to give me something. Right. We know it's not equal to live sports, certainly, but there is just a giant void. And I think we thought, okay, could esports fill it or could other competition? And I think what we've learned in the study is there's very few things that it can actually really replicate and replace a live sports experience. So, it's critical when it comes back, it's right there for fans and that they can jump right back in.
Sure.
I want to talk on the next slide. This was another one that kind of changed how we thought of everything that was happening in the real world deprivation study, so to speak, with COVID-19. If you look at sports fans, one of the things we're finding is that a lot of the migration and behaviors that they were making were, when they thought about it, were actually due to the fact that live sports weren't on. It wasn't as though some of the SVOD services necessarily had better content during the coronavirus time. It was actually more to do with they were able to fulfill a need around entertainment content as sports went away. Right. And that people are already thinking that once sports comes back, they're going to be doing less of those behaviors. So we wanted to understand what specifically they're going to be doing less. I think we're going to see a lot less viewing on streaming services among this cohort in prime times and in times of live sports, obviously. People said they're going to be watching less movies. using social media less, potentially playing games less, a lot less if you're an under 40 sports fan. And then even binge watching or texting with friends and family, everything we're doing every day. Those, it makes sense that those will take a hit as live sports comes back, and they're going to return to more normal numbers we saw pre-COVID.
Right.
Because I think one of the narratives that was coming out early when we saw all of these massive bumps was, wow, we just threw an accelerant on everything, and this is actually the future of where it's all going. And not to say that, we won't see more sports on digital platforms and subscription video services, but I think, now we look at it as a lot of that was really because you just completely lost all of the time that live sports was on linear television.
Right. The other thing that's interesting that we talked about here in the office is, obviously the Hollywood production community is kind of silent right now. So there's going to be a bit of I think if sports can get going, they'll have even more of an opportunity because you may not have a lot of, shows that were traditionally there able to be part of the fall schedule potentially because they're just not in production. So I don't know how that's going to, I don't know the details of that, but I don't know what your thoughts are on that, and whether that could be even more of an accelerant to get sports even higher because they're maybe the only game in town for
yeah, I think as you think about the pay TV bundles, especially over the next, anywhere from 6 to 18 months, as productions are delayed, as less shows come live, to your point, I just think you're going to see sports and news. They were already holding up the bundle, as a lot of people talked about. They're just going to become so essential that I think distributors are really going to have to reconsider in some ways the pricing structures and how much these matter to the bundles, because you're absolutely right. If the primetime schedules and the spring seasons aren't going to be as strong next year, one thing that potentially will be very strong is going to be live sports still and holding up ratings and ad dollars in the community. So that was mostly the idea here and the urgency we're seeing and the shift back likely when live sports returns. One other thing we wanted to understand, I'll talk a little bit about, is the dynamic of no fans. And it's really interesting to see how some of the leagues are already starting to deal with this in Europe and in the soccer community. And there's been a lot of experimentation, and certain leagues have talked about it here, what they're planning to do. How do you recreate an atmosphere of excitement and create sort of a live atmosphere if these arenas or stadiums are just not going to be full of fans? One of the things, too, we wanted to understand was just the notion of how is that going to affect the viewer to start with? Are they still going to come in? And right away, we saw 90% of people basically in the study, 89% here, saying that, they're still going to watch live sports regardless of the fans. And that was, again, about a combination of liking the competition, fandom for individual teams. You're just a sports viewer. The fans are great, but at the end of the day, you want to watch the competition. One of the things we did see, though, as we dug into this further, is the innovation we're talking about. How do you bring fans into the stands? How, do you do sort of computer-generated fans? Are you going to pipe in sound? How do you pipe in sound? Those things will really matter. And I think the first place consumers say that they're going to look for that experience, for that sports experience, is actually going to come through the announcers. Mm-hmm. So the on-air team, what can the on-air team bring to the event that really brings up the level of excitement, enthusiasm when you're watching? Because it can't simply be their typical broadcast in a lot of ways, because where they may be leaning on the fans to bring the excitement and to watch the momentum changing and shifting, that's out the window. So it'll be really interesting to see how the viewers react in those first few weeks in particular to see how the broadcasts look.
Yeah, we talked to some of the directors, and obviously their challenge is, how do they want to add emotion to the broadcast? So some of them are saying, well, you need to have more cameras, right? Because you have to, or different angles. You need something to kind of convey more excitement because the audio isn't there. And to your point, what's fascinating about in the booth and the announcers is, we've had a lot of discussions here in the office as far as the legacy of all this stuff. And one of the things we see is this whole Zoom culture, the ability to kind of have, LeBron James, for example, pop into the booth via Zoom while another team is playing just because he's got nothing else to do because he's under quarantine. Could be really fascinating as far as new dynamics that you just never really saw in traditional broadcast, because it'll always be like rolling up a satellite truck that would cost you, $15,000 and da-da-da-da-da. So it'd be fascinating to see how that happens too.
Yeah, and I think the more innovative the ideas are, and if they flow into just the nature of the broadcast, they're going to work. You know, your
Right.
LeBron example is a good one. I mean, you know, if you want to hear what he
Right.
thinks about other teams he may be playing in the next round,
Right.
that makes a lot of sense. So it can't be too gimmicky,
Right.
but if you can shed some light on the game or bring a different angle of excitement, you know, one of the things we've heard in the NFL is, you know, are they going to start miking up more players? I think you will probably see more players being mic'd, probably not to the point where everyone's mic'd for obvious reasons. But, you know, I do think you're going to have to go beyond on the productions to really bring some extra value to it moving forward.
Yeah. But the good news is that they will be tuning in.
The good news is they're going to be there, right?
Right.
So they're going to be looking for what you're going to bring to the table. But I think it's important for the industry to realize that even though it comes back, they're going to be there. They're going to have a high bar of expectation because they're going to be looking, you know, they're going to be remembering the last time they watched sports and how exciting that broadcast may have been. So, you know, they're going to really have to bring it, especially, you know, the difficulty of coming right back into the playoffs or right back into the playoffs and there's no fans. You really are going to have to create an atmosphere of excitement and a playoff atmosphere.
Yeah, we've been joking about the game-winning home run in the to win the World Series, and there's no fans in the stands, and sort of that vacuum
Right?
of just.
Hey, how do you do it?
Yeah.
No, and you know, the New York Times had an interesting article a couple of weeks ago about a league in Denmark that's doing Zooms and putting fans in the stands. I think you're going to start to see more of things like that too, and experimenting. You know, it doesn't hurt to try it once or twice. If it doesn't work, maybe go and do something else. But I think you're going to see a number of experiments to see, okay, well, what can actually make this a must see television.
Right.
And then finally, one of the things we wanted to understand is the background of this deprivation study, which is how is this a risk to cord cutting in some ways? And you know, I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier, Ken, where you know this whole notion of cord cutting and to some degree the RSNs and others, where you know you know how important are they to the bundle essentially, especially if some of these other productions are going to be delayed. We're already seeing that, you know, two-thirds tell us that if their current provider doesn't offer live sports or the sports they're looking for their team, they're going to switch. There's a lot of inertia historically in the space. We know that it's pretty difficult to switch your cable provider or your television provider, but this group values live sports so much that if they're not getting everything they want to when it comes back, or you know they're not seeing it in, you know, a year from now, I think you're going to see high likelihood of switching behaviors. No doubt, the under 40s are even more likely to switch. Because potentially they're used to it, and they know maybe their options on the marketplace more than some other fans. So we really think that increasingly as sports rights come up, distribution deals come up, one of the things that this period has shown us is that live sports is essential for television. And these deals basically need to get done in a lot of ways. Otherwise, the fans are going to find the deals and they're going to migrate to the providers that have them because this is already essential. You're seeing a lot of people holding on to their pay TV bundle, just waiting until they get that date, July 30th for the NBA to return, for instance, or another date. So, you know, they've held on to the bundle. They're waiting. That's where the value is. We really need to make sure that it's still there in the ecosystem. Otherwise, certain distributors, certain parts of the ecosystem are really going to struggle without, you know, having a full library of live sports.
So how does this last bit, do you think, change the conversation, if you will, between the powers that be, if you will, which are obviously the RSNs and the MVPDs? So does it change the conversation at all? Do you feel that the RSNs, I know it's always a bit of obviously, clearly, for good reason. So what's your sense on the conversation, how this changes it?
I think in how it changes it reframes it by looking a little bit again at the deprivation nature of what's been happening and really highlighting how much these people, not only is it the single number one valued genre, but there's going to be more value moving forward. And I think, this is a trend that we've just been seeing year over year almost, in terms of when we look at different studies where we try to understand where is the value in the pay TV bundle. Sports continues to increase, news continues to increase. A lot of other areas are decreasing with other competition in the marketplace, especially from SVODs and digital pure plays. So I think, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if you're a distributor, you really need to take this seriously in terms of the live sports. We know that they're valued. I'm not sure. I think they may be still undervalued, according to what we're seeing in the data and sports fans telling us. Sports fans essentially told us it was undervalued, more than I really realized until COVID happened. So I think that's going to change some of the calculus in terms of some of the deals potentially. That's just what the data is suggesting.
Right. Well, I mean, there's some deals I've been reading about the papers this week that it seemed pretty big.
Yeah.
Possibly that are coming down the pike. What about in general? What about for the non-traditional, not the RSNs, but for like the, I like to say, the Amazons of the world who are saying, well, maybe I want to get into sports. What do you see as the value of there as far as the proof here that sports does hold a value and can draw people to their platforms?
Well, yeah, I think it's something, again, that they've been monitoring for a long time. Amazon's experimented a little with it. Obviously, a number of these services have the deep pockets. One of the things that's just everyone's been talking about is when the league rights come up, how strong will they play at the table? And I think you're gonna see them. I think the SVODs and a lot of these digital pure plays, you look at data like this, they know the value, they know what they're missing on their services. Their services are already strong. But again, you're thinking about long-term growth. You're thinking about domestic growth, potentially even international, new rights, new growth there. I just don't imagine a scenario where they continue to say, you know what, we're not interested in sports. I think for the long term, again, the growth prospects of these services, they're going to be looking really hard, and I think you're going to see them at the table. And it's going to be pretty interesting. Great for the leagues for the most part, of course. I mean, it's going to drive the prices up quite a bit. But again, one thing we have to think about is the fans are suggesting sports are being undervalued, which is really interesting. Again, long-term for all of these players.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating when you look at the launch of, because right now in my house I have HBO Max, I've got Disney Plus, I've got Apple TV, which is the craziest service because you can't really find their own content. Netflix, Amazon Prime, and so trying to find stuff now because everybody's keeping their own stuff, right? So they're kind of launching their own services. It becomes more complex to find stuff. You end up having to subscribe to 35 services to watch shows. And then sports becomes an easy differentiator, right? That you can say, okay, we have this, we're the only place to find this. I mean, trying to find out where a movie is challenging in today's environment.
Right. And to your point, adding a dynamic of, okay, this particular league's on this service and this league's on a different service. I don't think consumers want that. I don't think the leagues want that.
Right.
I think adding the level of confusion there is just not going to help anybody out. So but it's a real dynamic. I mean, it's something I think Amazon's had to wrestle with too, with having, okay, Amazon only has this particular Thursday night game. Well, what now? I'm switching my inputs to get this. There's a lot of consumer confusion clearly around that. But I do think that, we look out 10 years from now in the business, it has to be there, right? I mean, a world in which you're not going to see live sports distributed on more digital platforms, that's going to be really shocking. But we'll see what these rights deals look like and what the leagues want. But, I think it's in everybody's best interest, again, based on the data, to have this available to as many people as possible in a platform and in a way that they know how to get it and to watch it every week.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Andrew, for your time. Really appreciate it. Fascinating report. Obviously, we're all hoping that the sports comes back. I saw some Cowboys and I guess Texans players tested positive. So
yeah, today
here we go. Here comes the adventure. But but the NASCAR is going well and the golf went well. So I think we're getting there.
Yeah, and fans are going to be in the seats. They're going to be at home still, a lot of them on the weekends. So I think there's a captive audience for it, but obviously player safety is the most important thing. But we're all looking forward to everybody getting back and watching.
Sounds good. Excellent. Well, thanks again. When you get back into Manhattan, we can hopefully do some lunch. We owe you something.
Absolutely.
So appreciate your time and stay healthy out in Brooklyn. And
you too.
See you soon.
Thanks, Ken.